So we talked about the response by the West against the third world, right? And there was an economic, there was a political. And through this response, you get to the current global economic structures, this revised global system. So the question for us now is, well, what is this revised global system that is produced? So that's the question we'll try to answer. Before we get to, so the revised global system is a transnational one. The one that was there before was an international one. So I want to, let's first see what it was, what was the global economic system before it was changed, right? So the economic system that we had until the 1970s was one that was, we could call a national accumulation regime. Let me make my face smaller so you could see what I'm talking about. That it was a national accumulation regime. So what that means is, regime means a system, accumulation means the way that you generate profits, and national means within your nation state, within the boundaries or the borders of your state. So what we had previously, all the way up till 1970s, was the national accumulation regime, a system in which profit making was organized state by state by state, and was limited to the borders of every state. What that means was that production, how we produced stuff, was nationally contained. That we used to make things internally. So here's all of these different pictures of the assembly line of the Ford Motor Company, for example. That the car manufacturing took place within the United States. You know, one of the things that made Ford famous was his production facility called the River Rouge plant. The River Rouge plant was a plant that was created on the River Rouge. And the beauty of this plant, the innovation that was involved in it, was that at the beginning of the plant, you get all of these raw materials, different metals and things like that. And by the end of that assembly line, you get the car. So that the entire mechanism, from the building blocks to the end in which you get the entirety of the car, that entire process was housed within the River Rouge plant. And the River Rouge plant was in Michigan. So that national accumulation regime, the system through which profit making was contained within the state, was one in which we used to make stuff, production was contained within that country specifically. I mean, remember, the core countries used to manufacture. Manufacturing, industrialization used to occur in the core countries, and it was contained within those borders. So then you used to make stuff, and then you distribute it and you exchanged it. That exchange and distribution could occur internationally. Like interstate highway. International means between countries. So that trade was between countries. So that you make stuff and then you trade it externally between you and others. Just like the interstate highway is a highway that goes between states. So that, and then the money that you used to make, you used to put in banks, and those banks used to be able to use that to provide loans to others, and those banks were also contained within every country. So that production and finance was nationally contained, and distribution and exchange were international. Thus, if you wanted to figure out, well, how much did a country make? What was the extent of profit making in country X? All you had to do, given that the economy was contained within your country, was to figure out, well, how much is my country exporting minus how much am I importing? In other words, how much am I selling and how much minus how much I'm buying. And if I subtract how much I am buying from how much I am selling, I figure out how much money I have, right? So profit making accumulation was very simple, export minus import. Well, this was, and so then what the world looked like was every country, so imagine all of these little squares was an economy. Every economy was contained within one country. And then these countries used to trade globally between each other. This changes in the 1970s, or we start to see this change start to emerge. And the change, fundamentally, the thing that changes is that we go from the River Rouge plant to a much more complex production, much more complex factory. So we used to have the assembly line of one product being, that assembly line was positioned in one country, within the borders of that country. But then what we start to have is that assembly line starts to break down, and we put different parts of that assembly line in different places, in different countries, based off of the advantages that those countries provide you in terms of lower wages and lower overhead costs. And remember, if you go back to our earlier discussions around profit making, that profit is a function of wages. So that if you could reduce wages, if you could reduce also overhead costs, then you produce more profits. So instead of working and all of your factory being in one country, what you do is you move your factory globally. And so you could make your in one country, you make one part of your final product. In a different country, you make another part of your final product. In a different country, you make another part, and then you bring all of these parts together to make the final product. So we go from a single country assembly line to a global assembly line. Now our assembly line no longer exists in one place, but it exists throughout. So we don't have this plant like the River Rouge plant anymore, where you go from the simple building blocks of a car to the entire car in one plant. Now now the car is made all over the world. So this is from an old illustration from the year 2003. It's probably much more complicated. So if you take a car, and it's all of its different parts are made in plants that are in different countries. I don't know jack about cars, but look, like France makes the alternator. The horse clamps are made in a factory in Sweden. The paint and the hardware could be made in the Netherlands. Norway makes the exhaust flanges. I don't know anything about cars. So all of these, suffice to say, all these different things of the car that used to be made, let's say in a plant like the River Rouge plant in one place, now the different parts get made in different places, get shipped all across the world to what's called assembly plants, and these assembly plants become closer to the point of distribution. They assemble them, and then they distribute the final product. This is a very, very different production scheme. It's a global production scheme. That production, the way that you produce the car, has gone from it being produced in one country to now it being produced globally. So that what you end up getting is, before you used to have, here's country A and here's country B. This is international trade, right? So one country sold to one country and then the other country sells back to this country. That's international trade. Now what you have is the assembly line of one company spans two countries. So that the assembly line of this car that we saw is part of its assembly line is in country A and part of it is in country B. So that what looks like are two countries trading with each other is actually trade that's occurring within the production line of one company itself. So that the assembly line moves through from one country to the other, from one country to the other. And what you start to get is production that is transnational. It's not production that is between countries. It's production that moves through the different countries. It's beyond the realm of the nation states. It works through its borders. So, you know what is constantly sometimes looked at as trade imbalances or trade between two countries is actually trade within a transnational corporation. So, for example, all these politicians, in the United States, every time there is a national campaign, and if they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to trade or why there is issues, they start talking about the trade imbalance and the trade imbalance between China and the United States and the fear-mongering of China and how the Chinese are being unfair to the US economy. Well, what the politicians are doing when they say that, they could be doing either of two things. One, that they're naive and thus they don't know how the economy works, or two, they think you're stupid and naive and they could trick you. Because what's actually happening is not a trade imbalance between the US and China, but rather that much of the manufacturing of corporations globally moves between China and the United States. So what China is producing is not for China, but what China is producing is for the commodities of companies that you think are American. So that Apple, for example, produces its phone in places like China. Does that mean China has a trade imbalance? Or does that mean that China and the United States as countries have become subsumed within, that the nation state has become subsumed into a global chain of production? A global chain of production that no longer understands or is responsive to the borders of the nation state. So this notion of a trade imbalance between the United States and China is a facade, is a political facade. The trade deficit of the United States in relationship to China is not a function of policies of one or the other party within the United States, but rather of the nature of global capitalism today. The nature of global capitalism today is one that has moved from the national accumulation regime to what we could talk about as a transnational accumulation regime. Meaning, so regime being a system in which profit making, in which accumulation is done through a transnational schematic. Transnational meaning beyond the borders of nation states, meaning through the borders of the nation state. So let's break that down. Production, finance, distribution, all of those things are now global or transnational. So production, no longer made in one country, now it could move all across the countries. Distribution, which was always international, now is also the same. And finance, banks, also then move their monies across countries without concern for which country that they're in. And that you could make your money, a transnational corporation could make its money in one country and house it in a different country, in a bank in another country. And given that there are the limitations on the movement of capital, on the movement of money has been lifted, you're free to move it between countries. In other words, in order for production, finance, distribution to become global or to become transnational, that means there must be a dramatic shift in the nature of borders within this new global order. Borders have been removed for two things. Borders in today's world don't exist or are very porous for capital, meaning money, and for commodities, meaning stuff. Commodities and money could move across borders. Borders are much more fluid for them. But that doesn't mean that borders no longer exist. Borders do exist, but those borders only exist for you and I. In fact, borders also don't exist for those of us who are very wealthy. The owners of the capital and the commodities that could move between borders, the owners of the money and of the stuff, those folks could also move. But labor, those who work in the factories that produce the value, produce the commodities and the value of the capital, those folks cannot move. The borders remain for those people. And thus, profit making by transnational corporation is global, and it's irrespective of national origin. This is where you get all these stories of companies like Apple, for example, its money being in Ireland, not in the United States. And it moved it to Ireland because Ireland wasn't taxing them. And then if Ireland starts taxing them, they're like, all right, well, we'll pick it up and move it somewhere else. That these companies are transnational entities now. I mean, think about it. These companies are transnational, meaning they produce stuff all over the world. Their employees, the people that produce them, their workers are from all over the world. The manager of these companies are from all over the world. The people who own these companies, the people who own the stocks of these companies are from all over the world as well. And they sell these products all over the world. So if you're looking at any one of these companies, if you look at Ford, what is American about Ford? Or look at GM. What is American about General Motors? Its workers are from all over the world. Its managers are from all over the world. Its board of directors is from all over the world. Its stockholders are from all over the world. It is a global company. And it could make more money outside the United States sometimes than it does inside the United States. And the money that it makes, it could put in banks that are outside the United States as well as inside the United States. So what is truly American about a company like Ford and GM? There's nothing American about them. Not because they're doing something different, but because capital or the economy has changed fundamentally, so that companies like GM and Ford have become now completely global, have become completely transnational. The only thing about Ford and GM that is American is the story they tell about themselves as being American. There is a nostalgia for a time in which Ford and GM were American. And thus people think that they're American. The only thing American about them is their PR, is their branding, is their advertisement. But in reality, the firms are transnational. And these are kind of symbolic of this entire kind of transnational accumulation regime. So where we are now is we no longer have these little economies that are bordered by state borders that then trade amongst each other internationally. What we have is increasingly one global economy in which everybody is integrated into it. That we are integrated into global assembly chains, into global commodity chains. We are integrated into global production, global distribution, and global accumulation. It's one global economy increasingly. And key for that global economy to exist is the borders become porous to capital and commodities. It's interesting to think about because commodities or stuff is made by people. And money or value is derived from the production of that stuff, which means that capital or money is a function of people. There are people that work, that produce stuff, which then produces this capital. Yet, the money and stuff produced by you and me has more rights than you and me. That the stuff and the money that you and I produce is able to travel across borders, but you and I have to show our passport, and if we don't have a passport, then then we cannot move, and there is all kinds of increasingly militarized ways in which our access to movement across borders that were artificially created, especially starting in the 1800s, uh, uh, limit our ability to move. But the stuff that we create is able to move. That the stuff that we create has more rights than us. It's an interesting thing to think about when we talk about the notion of mobility. So how did this whole thing, how did we go from this national accumulation regime to this transnational accumulation regime? Well, it occurs through neoliberal policies. Neoliberalism is a means to get us somewhere. So what are these neoliberal policies? Well, they include things like austerity measures. Austerity measures is when you cut government support for different social activities. So austerity measures could mean the government subsidies for healthcare, government subsidies for essential things like food or other things like that. It means cuts in government spending in general, deregulation and privatization of the public sector. So you take the things that used to be public and you sell them off and make them private. So for example, things like schools, instead of having public schools, then you privatize them, you start to create charters and more private schools, and schooling becomes an arena through which you could generate wealth. So the public realm is a realm in which you are not able to generate wealth. The private arena is the arena through which the same activity that's done in the public now is able to generate wealth. So one of neoliberal policies is the privatization of the public sector. Also, it's the removal of trade barriers to the movement of capital and commodities that we just talked about. And it's easing control on foreign capital. So you want to ease the ability of capital, of money, to be able to move around, right? If you have this global supply chain, if you have this global assembly plant, your assembly line is global, well, you want to be able to move your money between one place and another to be able to pay for this massive global assembly line. So easing controls on foreign capital is important. And you integrate banks globally so that banks across borders could start to speak to each other. So that neoliberalism, partially, one definition of neoliberalism is these sets of policies that facilitate the movement of capital and commodities across borders, and it facilitates the production of and the maintenance of a transnational accumulation regime. It is neoliberalism because it's based on classical laissez-faire economics. But that's neoliberalism as a means. Neoliberalism also has a goal. It's a method, but it also has an end in mind. The goal of the various policies that we just talked about of neoliberalism is to facilitate capitalism spreading across the globe, seeking new sites for production, plans, financial instruments, and consumer demand. In other words, what neoliberalism wants to do is to create a world that is ruled by the marketplace and protected by governments. The goal of neoliberalism is the creation of a world that is ruled by the marketplace, protected by governments. So it subsumes, it says the market comes first, the market rules, and the purpose of government is to protect that market rather than the other way around. It's not that the government rules and the market supports the government, it's the subsumption or the subordination of the government to the market. So we want to create a world governed by the market, protected by governments. So neoliberalism has a means, the policies, has an end, so world ruled by the market, protected by government, and it also has an ideology. Neoliberal ideology says that we are all free individuals. That there's no such thing as necessarily the social, that we are fundamentally individuals. That what we do is, we as individuals work in order to make money, in order to satisfy our needs and desires. So that the free individuals satisfy their needs and desires by then entering into the marketplace where those desires are and those needs are being sold by others. And the only place that sociality comes about is in the marketplace, in the mall, where we go to satisfy our needs and desires. We satisfy our needs and desires by buying them. We buy them by money. We get money by working ourselves. Well, how do we get that money through work? Well, what we are doing is we are working in order to meet somebody else's needs and desires, and thus in the marketplace we exchange that money that we produced by trying to alleviate somebody else's needs and desires between each other. And thus that exchange is self-regulating and produces the most good for the most people. That is where we get the notion of the invisible hand of the marketplace. So thus we are all disciplined by the market itself, by the mall, by the place where we go to shop. And based on this neoliberal ideology, the idea is the primacy of the political rights over economic rights. And the primacy of the individual, that we are all individuals, and the non-existence of the collective. Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, famously said, there's no such thing as societies. There's the individual, and there's the family. So based on this idea, there is no collective, there's only the individual. And rights then are those that are given to individuals. There's no such thing as collective rights. Any notion of collective rights infringes on the individual rights of people and the marketplace. So that neoliberalism itself is also an ethos. It is a metaphor. It becomes a metaphor for life itself. That the market becomes a metaphor for life. Businesses become a metaphor for human associations. I mean, think about it. We, as individuals, more and more start to talk about in ways that are closer to not human interaction, but the interaction of corporations. So we talk about, like, I feel good, like I'm kind of feeling good today for doing a bunch of stuff. And I tell myself, oh, I feel so good. I've been so productive. And then, you know, and part of the reason why I was productive today is because I was so efficient with my time. I did so many things in such a little time. And that gives me a good feeling about myself. Well, what is productivity and what is efficiency? Productivity and efficiency is the language of the assembly line. That what makes me feel good about myself is the same things that make the owner of the assembly line be happy about the assembly line. That his workers were productive, that his workers were efficient, so that he made surplus value, more surplus value, given that the wages that he paid went a longer way. Or, instead of having friends, I have a network. I have a social network. You're told, you know, go to conferences, meet people. You want to have a very expansive Rolodex. You want to network with others. Networking for others is different than having relationships and friendships. Networking, social networking, then is about how do I use the relationships that I have to further my economic goals and aspirations, my career. The same way that a corporation's network is about developing collaborative efforts in its effort to maximize its profits. So that instead of me as a person having relationships now with people that have nothing to do with promoting a specific economic agenda or my own career, or that my relationships with people become about my career rather than just about having friends, about self-development, right? So that as a people, we have started to take on the notion of businesses, that we are no longer Homo sapiens, that we more and more are Homo economicus. We're all little economic agents. We're all little corporations. When we interact with each other, we create networks. We don't create friendships. We feel good when we are productive and efficient, not when we, wasted time talking to family. That could be a waste of time. What did you produce? You didn't do anything. Hey, you're quarantined because of COVID. Make sure you're working. Go on Zoom. We're going to transition everything. Work cannot stop. At the very moment in which you are worried about your survival, where you should be developing relationships with loved ones and those around you to help people, the primacy that we put ourselves, the most important thing is, don't stop working. Right? We're all Homo economicus. Think about it this way. Here's another example of neoliberalism as an ethos, as a metaphor for life itself. In other parts of the world, or if we look at history in different communities, there's different types of jobs that are valorized, that are kind of, put on a pedestal and say, oh, we all should be like this. So, in various indigenous communities in the Americas, the prime protagonist of that community, the person that you looked up to, was the healer, the medicine man or the medicine woman. The healer was the person that you looked up to, somebody who healed the wounds of others. You go to other cultures, the monk is the person who people look up to, the ascetic, right? Somebody who puts their spiritual, otherworldly, personal kind of growth, they put that in front of their physical needs. You look up to that. Yet in other places, it could be the most learned, the scientist, or the thinker. Think about the United States. Think about the modern moment. Who do we look up to? The entrepreneur. What are we said to? What are the qualities that we are told we ought to have? We are told to have entrepreneurial ethos or entrepreneurial spirit. There's an office of just in Cal State Long Beach, there's all of this language around the need for entrepreneurialism. How do you teach entrepreneurial characteristics? How do we become entrepreneurs? Well, what is an entrepreneur? What is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is somebody who is creative, who is innovative, but his creativity and innovation is in the service of one thing and one thing alone. And that is, how do you transform an activity that previously was not connected to any kind of monetary gain to one in which he is able to make money off of? That is an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is somebody who is able to generate wealth out of an activity that previously did not generate wealth. That is the prime protagonist in a neoliberal society. Because the notion of accumulation that is the primary job of a corporation has become the metaphor for how we ought to live as human beings. We are no longer Homo sapiens, we are Homo economicus. So that neoliberalism then is an ethos, a metaphor for life based on a neoliberal ideology that pushes specific type of policies, that produces a specific type of ends. That ends being a world ruled by the market, protected by governments. So how were these neoliberal policies implemented? Well, in core countries, these policies were implemented as a response to the class compromise. It was pushed by the elites who wanted to generate they were not making as much profits as they were before, so now they wanted to push and make more profits. So they said we need to break that class compromise and expand beyond the United States borders, and we need to move and ship our productive capacities to other parts of the world that paid lower wages. So forget those union contracts that we signed in which we paid people money more money to work. We're going to pay people less money elsewhere, in places that also have less regulations on health, on working conditions, and we're going to break that class compromise, and that will generate more money for us than it was before. That happens in the core countries. In the periphery countries, in the third world countries, sometimes it was implemented voluntarily by elites who were brought into power. So sometimes it was voluntary, it was implemented by elites who broke with the unlikely alliance of the third world project to push for further integration with former core countries. That's the one way. The second way it was implemented was through economic pressures, through structural adjustment programs or other conditional loans, meaning that third world projects wanted to invest in their countries, so they needed loans. Well, then these loans were given to them. When you couldn't pay back those loans, more loans were given to you, but this time they said, we'll give you this loan, but if we give it to you, then you have to make all of these changes to your economy. You know how you were going to use all that money to pay for schooling? Well, you no longer could pay for schools. You have to put it here. You remember how you were going to produce create a healthcare system and invest in your healthcare system? Well, you no longer could do that. You need to cut your subsidies to those places. You need to cut those programs in order to pay back these loans. So we're going to give you loans with conditions on them. And those conditions were the neoliberal policies that we talked about. So one way is at least voluntarily in the periphery countries making these changes. The second way was through structural adjustment program. And the third way was through just outright extra economic means. Through the threat or actual military intervention, you shift and alter the way that that country's economy was set up. That's what happened in Iraq, for example, in 2003. The impact of these neoliberal policies on the third world meant the end of economic nationalism. It meant that in those third world countries that they had to favor elites and businesses that were geared towards transnationally geared to the outside rather than businesses that were geared to the inside. So once again, the neoliberal policies in the third world meant to going back to creation or production for the purpose of meeting global demand rather than local demand. This time it was because you needed money to pay back your loans, and the way you were going to make that money is by selling stuff externally. And so then thus they became reintegrated into this global economy. And it was a move away from employment as a source of bettering the standard of living. You remember that quote from our friend Raul Prebisch, to the drive to find the most flexible labor, it was to find the labor that was going to do was going to push itself to the limit at the cheapest price. Employment, in other words, for the need of transnational corporation. It meant the erosion of welfare programs, and it meant the erosion of the power of the G77 and the non-aligned movements. In the core, in the West, neoliberal policies meant the age of austerity in which the government cut its programs, it cut welfare programs. It was the rise of the so-called trickle-down economics, or the notion that you let the rich make a lot of money, and because they make so much money that at some point, some of that money will trickle down to the rest of us. And it was the discourse, you saw the discourse of individualism and bootstrapping, meaning that if you have a problem, if you have economic problem, or if you're poor, that's because of problems that you have personally, things that have to do with your own personal qualities that you need to change about yourself. You should be a harder worker. You should be more entrepreneurial rather than things that have to do structurally with the way that the economy is structured and what that has done to the jobs that you used to work. And it has meant a shift from, at least within the consciousness of race, from a discourse of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King to one of tokenism and symbolism. So that in the core and in the West, when they talk about issues of discrimination and racism, now we talk about them as issue of symbolic things, matters of representation, of, well, you know, we need to have somebody of this complexion in this place of power, rather than talking about what is that person actually going to do. Substantive policies. So the symbol becomes more important than the substance itself. And so as a result of the rise of this neoliberalism, of the rise of this transnational accumulation regime, what we've seen post-1970s is the restoration of class power. So the share in the national income of the top 0.1% of the population in the United States, Britain, and France has then began to recover from where it was in the 70s. And this period here, where you had the class compromise, to where we are now, where we are recovering, where the percentage, the share of the national income that is held by the economic elite. And when you're looking at the workers, what this has meant is, if you look, again, this is the chart where the bars show you the real wages of workers, and this line here shows you productivity level. That the American worker throughout the second half of the 20th century has become extremely more productive, that the level of productivity has gone up. But until in the mid-1970s, productivity was going up at the same time that wages were going up. Now, granted, productivity was higher, like that productivity and wages were both going up. After the 1970s, with the emergence of these neoliberal policies, wages start to stagnate or go down, but productivity keeps going up. So the American worker is producing more value, but is getting paid less for that value. Right? Somehow, though, the American workers, we don't feel the fact that we're making less money, because we're still able to buy refrigerators, buy TVs, buy cars, and buy, like, we still seem to have the same purchasing power, even though our wages have gone down. Why is that? That's because now, instead of paying for those things with the money that we gain through our wages, now we pay for them through credit. Where the United States is the most indebted nation in the world, and probably in the history of the world. We are indebted, which is why, in a time when people cannot work, they are deathly afraid. Because it's not that they don't have any money, they have negative money. There's people after them. The same economic elite is after them, wanting not only the loans that they gave them, but interest on those loans back. That's the current political economic structure of neoliberalism, of global capitalism, of a transnational accumulation regime.